Snow fell silently across the marble driveway of a mansion built to keep the world out. Near its towering pillars, a scene unfolded that no amount of money could control. A homeless black teenage girl, her clothes worn and torn, sat on the freezing ground, her body shielding an elderly white woman from the cold. The woman leaned weakly against the girl's shoulder, her eyes closed, her strength fading. Just then, a luxury car screeched to a stop. Its door flew open. A billionaire in a red suit ran toward them, his face filled with shock and disbelief. Because the fragile woman being held by a homeless teenager wasn't a stranger. She was his mother, and in that frozen moment, everything he believed about power, race, and worth began to collapse. Backhand index pointing right before the story continues. Support meaningful stories like this. Like the video, share it, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel Black Legacy. The mansion loomed like a statement of permanence. White marble pillars stretched toward the gray winter sky. Broad steps led to heavy oak doors, and golden light spilled outward, cutting through the snowflakes. For Julian Ashford, this home represented everything he had earned: security, influence, and control. Outside, however, control was an illusion. Julian's life had been built on decisiveness. By 32, he was a billionaire several times over, celebrated for his strategic brilliance and unflinching drive. The media praised his efficiency. Investors worshipped his clarity. In Julian's mind, effort and intelligence were the only currencies that mattered. Poverty was a distant footnote, an unfortunate circumstance easily solved with money, never with empathy. Margaret Ashford, his mother, was a different story. She had grown up in modest circumstances, learned to stretch every dollar, and survived loss before wealth had transformed her life. Even now, after decades of luxury, she carried herself with humility, walking instead of riding when she could, speaking to staff with quiet respect, and insisting that true humanity was measured not by status but by attention to others. She believed the world revealed itself only to those willing to step beyond comfort. That morning, despite snow and cold, Margaret had chosen to leave the mansion and stand at the edge of the driveway. Julian had barely registered her decision, his mind consumed with meetings, emails, and mergers. The driveway was private. Danger seemed impossible. And yet, life often revealed lessons in unexpected ways. Near the stone wall at the side of the driveway, Aisha Thompson crouched, knees pulled close to her chest. 16 years old, homeless for nearly a year. She had learned to vanish in plain sight. Her mother had passed away suddenly. Relatives refused responsibility. Shelters were overcrowded, temporary, and selective. Survival meant invisibility. Every day, Aisha navigated judgment, indifference, and outright hostility, understanding that her presence often provoked fear before recognition. The snow had begun to coat her hair and shoulders. She was cold, hungry, and exhausted, yet her mind remained alert. She noticed every movement of the world around her, every footstep crunching over frozen stone, every shadow that could conceal danger. When Margaret's foot slipped on the icy driveway, Aisha acted without thought. She rose quickly, catching the older woman with a steadying arm and guiding her carefully to the ground. Her own body shivered in the cold, yet she made space for Margaret to lean against her. Titles, money, and power dissolved in that instant. There was only need, instinct, and the fragile warmth of shared humanity. Margaret leaned into her, trusting the girl entirely, allowing herself to be held. In that moment, Aisha felt both the weight and rarity of trust, a fleeting validation that human connection could exist even amidst neglect and poverty. Inside the mansion, Julian's sharp gaze caught the unfolding scene. His heart pounded. Panic surged. His mother, outside on the ground, supported by someone he had always seen as other, someone society had taught him to fear. Assumptions built over decades surged like a tidal wave. He didn't pause to interpret, didn't hesitate to act. He ran. His polished shoes struck the icy stone with authority and urgency. The red of his suit cut through the snow, a signal of wealth and command. Yet, as he closed the distance, his panic gave way to confusion. Margaret's posture remained calm. Her eyes were closed, breaths even. She wasn't calling for help. She wasn't fearful. And the girl, thin, cold, fragile, held her with care, with quiet dignity. Julian slowed. The contradiction unsettled him. Wealth could not buy this moment. Status could not command it. The image in front of him shattered assumptions, forcing him to confront a reality he had long ignored. That worth was not measured by money, that humanity could be found in those he had overlooked. Around them, snow fell silently, covering footprints and differences alike. The scene was a mirror reflecting truths Julian had spent years avoiding. The fragility of life, the strength of youth, and the quiet, often invisible dignity of those living on the margins. It was here at the edge of his driveway in the quiet snowfall that Julian first understood the gap between perception and reality, and that understanding would demand everything he thought he knew. Julian's red suit cut through the white snow as he closed the distance between himself and the scene. Each step echoed with urgency, but the closer he got, the less he understood. Margaret remained calm, leaning lightly against Aisha, her trust unwavering. The girl's small, fragile frame seemed almost insufficient to hold an elderly woman, yet she did so with surprising steadiness. Julian's mind scrambled to interpret what he saw. Years of privilege had trained him to read power and vulnerability quickly, but this defied every script he knew. Aisha felt the shift in energy before she saw him. Her instincts, honed from months of avoiding suspicion, braced her for confrontation. She adjusted slightly, still supporting Margaret but creating space, a silent signal that she meant no harm yet expected none in return. This was a dance she had performed countless times, each movement a lesson in survival. Margaret opened her eyes as Julian approached, sensing the tension in the air. She knew the look on her son's face, the mixture of fear, confusion, and authority. Julian had always been the kind to act decisively, to control outcomes, and this moment had nothing to control except truth. She drew herself slightly taller, not a challenge, but to remind him and herself that some lessons could not be rushed or enforced. The snow muffled the world around them, but the silence felt heavy. The driveway, the pillars, the distant glow of the mansion, all became a stage where every movement mattered. Julian stepped slowed as he registered the reality in front of him. Aisha's careful support, Margaret's calm, the absence of panic. The assumptions he had carried for years about race, class, and worth began to crumble under the weight of observation. A small crowd had gathered beyond the private gates, neighbors and passers-by who had caught sight of the commotion. Phones lifted, capturing the unlikely tableau. The city beyond might have been insulated from this moment, but the spectators were witnesses to a collision of worlds. Wealth meeting vulnerability, fear confronting empathy. Julian became aware that his actions, as always, were being recorded, judged, and possibly misunderstood. The stakes were no longer just personal, they were social. Aisha tightened her grip subtly as Julian stopped a few feet away. She didn't flinch. Years of navigating danger had taught her that fear could be weaponized against her. She held Margaret firmly but carefully, signaling she was ready to release support if necessary, yet unwilling to abandon the woman who had trusted her implicitly. Her heartbeat was rapid, but her demeanor remained composed. She knew every gesture carried meaning. Julian's eyes darted between the two figures. His mother's frailty, the girl's resilience, the precarious balance, it all demanded interpretation. The billionaire in him wanted to assert control, to rescue, to correct what his mind insisted was wrong. Yet, instinctively, he hesitated. The situation did not need his command. It needed observation, understanding, reflection, and this realization unsettled him more than any boardroom defeat ever had. Margaret reached out, lightly touching Aisha's arm. The gesture was simple, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of affirmation. You are seen. You are trusted. The small act did more than stabilize Margaret. It challenged Julian's worldview. In that single touch, he recognized that power was not always about control, that authority could be expressed without domination, and that value existed independent of wealth. Julian exhaled slowly. He had lived in a world where visibility equaled credibility. A person unseen was assumed unworthy. Yet here was Aisha, unseen by society, standing as an anchor for someone who had everything. The inversion struck him sharply. His assumptions about danger, dependency, and merit had blinded him to the humanity before him. Nearby, a a security guard emerged, drawn by the unusual gathering. His eyes scanned quickly an elderly woman leaning on a black teenager. He shifted, instinctively positioning himself to intervene. Julian noticed immediately power move at the subtle gestures of authority, and he raised a hand. The guard froze, recalibrating. Julian's presence alone redirected the flow of potential conflict, yet the reality remained. If he had not been there, Aisha might have been scrutinized, questioned, or worse. The fragility of safety, contingent on wealth and visibility, settled like ice in Julian's chest. Margaret, sensing the underlying tension, steadied herself further. She looked directly at Julian, her eyes calm but unwavering. The message was clear. This moment was not about fear, about reputation, or about what others might think. It was about human connection. She had chosen Aisha, just as she had chosen to see the world with compassion, and she would not be moved by instinctive bias or inherited assumptions. Julian stepped closer, still observing, still wrestling internally. The red of his suit was bright against the snow, a symbol of status and intention. Yet all the colors, all the luxury, all the certainty in the world could not dissolve the lesson unfolding. He began to see clearly Aisha's strength, Margaret's empathy, the fragility of assumptions. Each frame of the tableau spoke volumes about injustice, resilience, and perception. Aisha sensed a subtle shift in Julian's stance. He was no longer just rushing to correct. He was evaluating, processing, understanding. She released a fraction of tension in her shoulders, but remained poised. Trust for her was earned through consistency, through restraint. Julian had not yet proved anything. Yet the first sign that he could see, that he could truly observe without judgment, offered a sliver of hope. Snow continued to fall, layering the driveway in quiet white. Time seemed to slow. The world beyond the gates moved on, indifferent, unaware of the lessons in empathy, awareness, and human dignity taking place. For Julian, the weight of inherited assumptions pressed heavily. For Aisha, every instinct honed for survival remained alert. For Margaret, decades of lived experience affirmed the quiet power of presence over control. Julian finally stopped, mere feet away, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The crowd of onlookers, hidden beyond walls and trees, seemed to hold its collective breath. The tension was no longer about danger or accident. It was about acknowledgement, recognition of humanity where privilege had expected dependency, validation of strength where society had assumed weakness. This realization, though subtle, was seismic. At that moment, Julian understood the fragility of perception. He grasped how easily fear could be mistaken for threat, and how often society assigned value based on wrong measures. He began to see Aisha not as a problem to solve or a danger to manage, but as a human being navigating her own world, deserving of dignity and space. The driveway, the snow, the mansion, all became less significant than the three figures at its center. Every footstep, every glance, every unspoken acknowledgement carried meaning. Julian's internal conflict, the clash of power, expectation, and awakening, was a true drama. It would not resolve in minutes, in gestures, or in words. It would unfold over choices made in the coming hours, days, and weeks. And in the quiet, falling snow, the rising action reached its peak. The collision of worlds, the challenge to long-held biases, and the fragile emergence of understanding that would define what came next. Time seemed to stretch on the snowy driveway, each second amplified by the weight of observation. Julian stood just a few feet from them, his red suit a stark contrast against the white blanket of snow, yet his presence felt almost secondary to the quiet gravity between Margaret and Aisha. He had expected chaos, panic, perhaps even danger. Instead, he found calm, dignity, and the unmistakable proof that his assumptions had been wrong. Aisha's arms remained steady, her thin frame supporting Margaret's weakened posture. The girl's hands were small, cold, yet purposeful. Every subtle movement carried confidence, learned from months of surviving in a world that had largely ignored her. Julian had never seen strength like this before. Not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, not in the faces of those he considered equals. Here was resilience stripped to its rawest form, and it unsettled him profoundly. Margaret, sensing Julian's hesitation, gave him a soft, almost imperceptible nod. The gesture was simple, but it conveyed centuries of experience. Observation over assumption, understanding over panic, humanity over hierarchy. She had raised Julian to see the world clearly, but wealth and ambition had blinded him. Now, confronted with undeniable truth, he could no longer ignore what was before him. The snow continued to fall, muffling the world beyond the mansion. A distant car engine hummed, but the driveway existed in its own suspended reality. Julian's heart raced, not from exertion, but from the confrontation with his own biases. Every instinct urged him to assert control, to rescue, to correct. But as he looked at Aisha, he realized that control here was irrelevant. Respect and recognition were what mattered, and he had to let the moment teach him. A security guard from a nearby outbuilding emerged cautiously, eyes scanning the scene. Julian's hand lifted instinctively, a silent signal. The guard paused, hesitation rippling through his posture. Authority was obeyed, but only when wielded wisely. Julian registered the ease with which he could command obedience, and the disparity of who benefited from it. If he had not been here, the guard's attention would have been solely on Aisha. The realization struck him like ice. Margaret adjusted slightly, leaning into Aisha's support while keeping a calm gaze on Julian. Her presence was firm, steadying, yet free from fear. She had always believed that real lessons were learned when discomfort met reflection. Julian, for the first time, was facing the discomfort of his own assumptions in full view. The wind shifted, carrying whispers from the small crowd beyond the gates. Phones were raised, capturing the scene. For Julian, this was no longer private. The scrutiny, once a distant concern, had arrived, and yet, for the first time, he considered perception secondary to truth. What mattered was understanding, not image. Aisha shifted gently, releasing just enough weight to signal control without abandoning her charge. Every instinct in her body screamed caution. Trust had always come at a price. Yet Julian's slowed approach, his absence of immediate accusation, allowed a tentative trust to emerge. She realized he was seeing, truly seeing, without rushing to judgment. That alone was revolutionary. Julian's breathing deepened. He studied the girl's face, noting the hunger, the cold, the exhaustion, but also the fire, the resilience, the courage. He realized how rarely his life had demanded this kind of fortitude. Privilege had insulated him from fear, from scarcity, from judgment based on skin rather than action. And now, in the stillness of falling snow, that insulation dissolved. Margaret reached out lightly to touch Julian's arm. The gesture was grounding, not commanding. It reminded him that power was not always about authority. It could be about presence, about awareness, about standing as witness. Julian felt a shift within himself. His mind raced, not with business calculations, but with reflection. How many Aishas had he overlooked? How many assumptions had he allowed to govern action? How had wealth blinded him to reality? The subtle crunch of tires announced a nearby police patrol, slowing as they approached the gates. Julian's pulse quickened, not for fear, but for recognition. Aisha tensed immediately. Her body knew the drill. Visibility often came with danger. But Julian stepped forward, placing himself fully between the girl and potential scrutiny. His posture declared, without words, that she was not alone, that judgment without understanding would not proceed unchecked. The officers paused, scanning Julian's suit, Margaret's frailty, and Aisha's worn appearance. Bias flickered, recalibrated. Julian watched silently, absorbing the dynamics. His presence, his privilege, altered the assumptions that had once condemned Aisha. Before a single word was spoken, he felt a pang of guilt at how easily perception could be manipulated, how uneven the scales of justice truly were. Margaret straightened fully, breathing shallowly, her eyes flicking between her son and Aisha. She saw the internal shift unfolding in Julian and knew that the real climax was not physical. It was moral, internal, seismic. Julian's awakening, catalyzed by the trust and courage of a homeless girl, represented a confrontation with decades of unexamined assumptions. The officers eventually withdrew, satisfied by the visible order. The crowd beyond the gates dispersed, some in relief, others in contemplation. Snow continued to fall silently, a reminder of impermanence, of fleeting moments, of the quiet but powerful transformations that can occur in a single tableau. Julian knelt slightly, not to dominate, not to claim heroism, but to observe fully. He studied Aisha's face, her hands, her posture. He noticed details he had never allowed himself to see in any person outside his circle of wealth. Every mark of survival was a testament to resilience. Every measured movement was a lesson in quiet authority. Every glance reflected intelligence and courage. The driveway, the mansion, the snow, all receded. What remained was a profound human truth. Dignity and worth exist independently of fortune or fear. Julian understood finally that his life had been incomplete, insulated from realities that had shaped countless others. The climax was not in an act of rescue or intervention, but an acknowledgement, recognition, and the confrontation of privilege with unfiltered humanity. Aisha's posture remained strong, her gaze steady yet cautious. She had survived this far on instinct and observation, and now she added another layer. Hope, born not from charity, but from being truly seen. Margaret, content in the quiet victory of human connection, let the moment linger, aware that some lessons could not be rushed. And Julian, once defined by certainty, control, and achievement, found himself suspended in uncertainty. But this uncertainty was not fear, it was awakening. The world, he realized, had shifted in front of him, revealing truths no wealth could purchase, no power could mandate. And in the stillness of that snowy driveway, the climax had been reached, a collision of privilege, resilience, and the undeniable force of humanity, standing quietly, steadfast, and undeniable. The snow continued to fall, covering the driveway in a pristine white blanket, but for Julian, Margaret, and Aisha, nothing felt the same. Time outside the mansion had slowed, stretched, and revealed truths that no boardroom contract or press release could ever teach. The world beyond the gates went on as usual, but the three at its center had crossed an invisible line, one that could never be uncrossed. Margaret helped herself to her feet, steadying against the cold stone wall. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, and confident, the grace of years tempered by life's lessons. Julian stayed close, not to assert authority, but to observe and support. He noticed, for the first time, the subtle details of human frailty and resilience, the shiver of a body fighting cold, the careful positioning of hands to convey both assistance and respect. Aisha remained on the driveway, hesitant but firm, aware that she had just been recognized not as a threat, but as a person of dignity. She had learned that trust was fragile, fleeting, and often exploited. But here, it was offered without pretense or expectation. The gesture from Margaret, the acknowledgement from Julian, created a space that felt impossibly rare, a space where humanity transcended status, race, and fear. Julian extended a hand, not in command, but in quiet respect. It was a subtle acknowledgement of all that he had misunderstood for years. Aisha studied him carefully, weighing every movement, every inflection, every intention. Finally, she allowed the contact, not because she trusted easily, but because she could see the sincerity in his hesitation, the authenticity in his presence. In the following days, Julian's world shifted. Meetings felt hollow, press releases meaningless. The wealth and power he had accumulated were suddenly insufficient. They could not repair systems that left children like Aisha in the shadows. They could not correct the assumptions he had carried blindly, nor erase the quiet injustices baked into every corner of the city he had long ignored. Awareness demanded action, and action demanded humility. He began with small but intentional steps. Housing, education, legal support, resources were offered discreetly, strategically, without fanfare. Julian learned that assistance was not about heroism or public recognition. It was about creating systems that preserved dignity while addressing need. The work was slow, meticulous, and deeply personal. For once, he was not trying to bend the world to his will. He was learning to navigate with care. Margaret observed all of it with quiet pride. Her life's mission had always been to cultivate awareness, empathy, and courage, and now it unfolded before her eyes and her son. But she knew the journey was far from complete. Change was never linear, and the lessons of the snowy driveway had to be lived daily, not celebrated as a single event. For Aisha, the world began to shift subtly as well. Stability, once alien, became tangible. She could sleep without fear of eviction, eat without planning the next deprivation, and imagine a future that stretched beyond survival. Yet she remained cautious. Trauma leaves its imprint, and trust takes time to cultivate. But within her, a spark had ignited, a recognition that she could exist fully, without compromise, and be seen for who she truly was. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and dominance, transformed subtly in Julian's eyes. It became a base for reflection, a point of contact with reality, and a reminder that privilege comes with responsibility. He began hosting quiet sessions, engaging with young people like Aisha, understanding their stories, learning the nuances of injustice that money alone could never solve. The city around them continued, oblivious in its rush. But Julian's perception had irrevocably changed. He noticed the people were overlooked, the subtle prejudices embedded in routine actions, the microaggressions that compounded silently into systemic barriers. He no longer viewed poverty as a distant issue, nor did he reduce inequality to statistics. He saw lives, choices, and the resilience it took to exist in a world that often ignored human worth. Margaret remained the guiding force. She reminded Julian that transformation is rarely immediate, that true impact is measured over time, and that accountability outweighs applause. She discouraged him from seeking media coverage or public accolades. This was not about narrative. This was about truth. Aisha, gradually, began to trust in consistency. She discovered mentors, allies, and resources without the baggage of judgment. She could envision school, art, and even leisure, concepts that seemed distant or forbidden. Most importantly, she understood that being seen did not require performing worthiness. Her dignity existed inherently, and others were learning to recognize it. The moral of the story became clear. Proximity matters. Awareness begins when people encounter lives unlike their own without the armor of assumption. Julian's journey revealed that racism and inequality are not always loud, not always intentional, but always consequential. Recognition, empathy, and the willingness to act responsibly are what bridge the divide. This encounter on a snowy driveway did not erase injustice. Systems still failed. Biases still existed. Struggles remained. But it demonstrated the power of one moment to illuminate truth, awaken conscience, and spark a chain of deliberate actions that could, over time, reshape lives. For the viewers, the lesson is stark and simple. Notice the people around you. Question the assumptions you carry. Extend humanity without expectation. Because as Julian, Margaret, and Aisha learned in the quiet collision of wealth, vulnerability, and courage, real change begins when we stop seeing others as statistics and start seeing them as people. If this story moved you, challenge your perspective, or inspire reflection, continue the journey with us. Like this video. Share it with others. Leave your thought in the comments. And subscribe to the channel Black Legacy for more stories that confront, enlighten, and transform.